Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Hold on, I'm trying to find. Oh no, that's okay. So Hegel, philosophy of right. So most class online, it's like highlighters. When you buy a pack of highlighters, everyone just wants the yellow, and then with chalks, you've got all these different colors, and all this one's big, this one, and all the white ones are like. Are like this. Oh. Okay. So last class we were looking at number 4 of the introduction to the philosophy of right. And this is where he introduces the idea of the will. And traditionally in philosophy, philosophers make a distinction between the kind of the will and the intellect. Within theology, so Hegel was trained as a theologian, and within theology there were these big arguments through the early modern period, going back to Plato, about what comes first, God's will or God's intellect. Does God first think and then act, or does he act and then think? Yeah, and Hegel in number 4 sort of questions this distinction. The end of number 4, he has this idea that he says on page 36 that the theoretical is essentially contained within the practical. So thinking, the intellect, is contained within the practical. So thinking is a way of acting. But then he also thinks that that the will contains the theoretical within itself. Yeah, so thinking is a way of acting, and acting is a way of thinking. And I think so. So Hegel wants to kind of question the distinction between the will and the intellect, between the theoretical and the practical. And I think for that reason, he's one of the kind of grandfathers of the kind of pragmatist tradition, action-oriented approaches to thought. So if you look at the American pragmatists like William James and Dewey and Peirce, they're kind of influenced by this sort of school. But anyway, he thinks that the sphere of the political, so the basis of right, and what do we mean by right? In German, we have the word Recht. It can mean law, it can mean justice. I think it's the sphere of right. It's just the sphere of sort of social normativity. And social normativity includes laws, it includes custom. We might think it includes social institutions. Social institutions have this sort of normative structure. I think if we think today, we might think that language is going to be part of this sphere. Hegel doesn't push this in the philosophy of right, but if you want a broader Hegelian approach. But the realm of right is the realm of social normativity, and its precise location and point of departure is the will. So the will is the kind of ground of right, of social normativity. That, as I said last time, we've got the philosophy of nature, and we might think of the realm of right as the realm of second nature. Yeah, it's not unnatural. So Hegel, I think one thing about Hegel is that he's a sort of naturalist. He wants to understand human agency, human activity as part of the natural world. He's not a reductive he's not a reductive naturalist who thinks we kind of reduce everything to physics, but he wants to see human agency and human activity as a natural part of the world. And the realm of right, the realm of social normativity, is what he calls second nature. This is an idea that you get in Aristotle, that second nature is that we have an animal nature, and then we acquire a second nature as a result of education, of Bildung, of culture, so that a child goes through this period of enculturation, of what? Enculturation, being having the culture. What? Maybe I just made up this word. Enculturation. Maybe I didn't spell it right, but it's it's a German word, Bildung, which can be translated as education. I'm thinking of education as a form of enculturation, where you have this culture around you, and in some sense, the culture around you, the culture around the child in which the child grows up, the child is encultured. They're filled with the culture. And in some sense, once you become an adult, you are an individual, but you're an educated individual. Your nature, you're not just this. So one of the things about Hegel is he's against a certain form of atomism. You know, I think Hegel's a liberal, but many traditional liberals are sort of atomists who have this idea that we can understand individuals apart from their societies. So we have this state of nature, which is the state of individuals outside of society. And then we ask, and I think this is what Hegel's sort of, one of the things that Hegel's rejecting, that as adults, we're beings who have a second nature, who are sort of encultured. Yeah, that our identity, who we are, partly depends on, you know, we're animals, but we're social animals. And who and what we are depends upon the nature of the communities in which we develop. So the basis of right is the realm of spirit. I'm suggesting that by spirit, that we think it's a human world, and we've got this sort of Aristotelian idea that humans are sort of rational animals. And what it is to be a rational animal is to engage in something like rational activity. And that's what the will is. We can think of will as something like, I mean, this is not Hegel's terminology. I'm trying to explain this in Aristotelian terms to make it simpler. But it's something like, we can think of the will as something like rational activity. And then we can think of right, we can think of the norms and institutions of the society we live in as the sort of expression and reification of this activity. And so in number 4, he's talked about the distinction between the practical and the theoretical attitudes. And in the theoretical attitude, we take something objective and make it subjective. Yeah, we've got the world, and then we conceptualize it. We abstract from things, and we have a subjective representation of the world. The sort of thought that is in Willing that we go from the subjective to the objective. What happens in Willing is that the subjective, the will, the thought is made objective. Yeah, so action, willing, is the objectification of thought. It's the objectification of spirit. It's the objectification of rational agency. If you've read any Marxist stuff, you have this idea of reification. Yeah, that capital is the reification of labor. It's what?
Verification, I mean, there's something backwards.
Well, what does the word reification mean? Right here. I'm not. Res is the Latin for thing, res. So reification is to make something a thing. So, the Marxist idea that he's taking this from Hegel, labor, what is labor? Labor is Geist. Labor is will. Labor is human rational activity. And what happens is that this activity is objectified. It's turned into stuff. What's it turned into? It's turned into capital. This is the Marxist, yeah?
Is it in this term, like there's thought that there was thought objectified? Doesn't this contradict with Hegel's understanding of non-intentional? It sounds like we have thought and we are objectifying it.
Yeah, so yeah, it's not first of all we have this inner representation and then this inner thing is, but we have this process of objectification. And in some sense, we only get, it's not like we have the representation before action, but we only get the representation after we've done it. So we sort of act, we create these institutions. And once we've created the institutions, the owl of Nineveh can fly and we can reflect on them. And we can kind of reflexively endorse or reject the institutions that we've sort of created. My sort of reading of this Hegelian idea, I think you can think of it, you can think of it sort of in evolutionary terms, but in terms of something like cultural evolution. The cultures are the expressions of reifications of human activity. And then there's going to be a certain logic that governs the way in which cultures emerge. Because the cultures that we create have to be compatible with, cultures themselves contain norms, which then in some sense undermine the cultures that we've created. Because the cultures that we've created don't live up to the norms that are internal to them. And the idea is that to feel at home in the world is to be encultured in a culture in which the norms of that culture allow us to reflexively endorse the culture. Yeah, that's basically the idea. So we've got this idea that social normativity, the institutions, the laws, the norms, the morals of the society we live in are expressions of human rationality. They're kind of constructs in a certain way of the will. And so if we want to understand right, we have to understand what it is to will something. And this is the task of page, and also the will equals is always free. Yeah, that's something, then we're going to have an account of freedom as well. What is freedom? What is willing? They turn out to be the same. So what is it to will? And that Hegel then has this sort of Hegelian precept where he asks, what is the will? And there are two aspects of willing, each one of which is one-sided. So we have the idea of the will as pure indeterminacy, the will as universal, the will as infinite. Yep. This aspect is going to be one-sided. Yeah, so this will understood as pure indeterminacy is universal as infinite. Sometimes he calls it the bad. I like it, the bad infinite. Yeah. Then we have this other aspect of the will as determinate. Particular. Finite. And this conception of willing, the will understood as universal, as indeterminate, as infinite, this is often the sort of will, the understanding of will that is connected with a certain type of radical conception. I'll come to your question in a minute. I just want to finish the overall sketch. And then often you might think, if you're conservative, you might think of the will in this way. And then we've got this conception of the will that somehow combines both of these. So that there's both of these are false, but they both contain some truth. But I take it the idea is that each one of these is abstract and defined in terms of each other. And so we have this idea of the will as absolute, that it's the unity of the infinite and the finite, of the universal and the particular, of it's the good infinite. And this is number 5. This is number 6. And then this idea of the will as absolute, we get in number 7. So we've got these two conceptions of what it is to have a will that are going to be sort of one-sided and inadequate. And somehow that both of them have some truth though. Yeah, so a proper understanding of the will keeps both, we have this absolute understanding. And the problem with the absolute is that Hegel himself thinks it's incomprehensible. It can't be understood. It goes beyond the understanding. So whenever you try and characterize this, you get into problems. And it turns out that understanding the will of absolute involves the whole of the philosophy of right and the whole of philosophy. Yeah, that you can only have this sort of will as a sort of citizen in a modern state that is well functioning. Yeah, so the will is only fully actual in a certain type of social situation. Yep.
I want to ask if this contrast is the Heideggerian contrast in the nothingness, sheer nothingness, and
I think that Heideggerian sort of distinction may be a descendant of this. Yeah, I think that one thing about German philosophy after Hegel is German philosophy after Hegel, for me, often seems like lots of people making Hegelian moves, claiming they hate Hegel. Yeah. So, because I think the Hegelian absolute, how you understand this, like, I think many people take the Hegelian absolute and take it as something like a given. And I think that's a sort of mistake. The Hegelian absolute is something more like a process rather than something given. So let's look at these two things. Because we've got, Hegel doesn't think there's a radical distinction between the theoretical and the practical. So this conception of the will, we might think of as the conception of the self. And there's a kind of this pure indeterminacy, there's a kind of intellectual analog of the will being like this, which is the idea of the Kantian I think that can accompany all of my thoughts. Yeah, so there's a theoretical conception of the I of self-consciousness, which in some sense is just purely abstract. That from one perspective, the I of the Kantian transcendental unity of apperception, my I and your I aren't any different. Yeah, it's a purely formal notion. So what he has to say about the I, the will is purely indeterminate, partly there's going to be a theoretical side of this as well. So let's have a look at the will as pure indeterminacy. So what is it to have a will? So and will is something that human beings have that other animals don't have, Hegel thinks. So this is what makes us human. So I take it like that we have this capacity to reflect on our desires, on our inclinations, on our drives, on our needs, and decide whether to endorse them or not. Yep, we're able to reflect on our animal being and decide whether to say yes or no to it. And this capacity to decide whether to act, yeah, this is the will as indeterminate. This is the will as infinite. So who else has this idea of the will as infinite in the history of philosophy? This is something, if you've read Descartes, in the fourth meditation, when I was teaching last semester, we didn't look at the fourth meditation, but Descartes talks about the understanding and the will. He says, like, human understanding is finite, but the human will is infinite, because whatever comes before us, we've got a capacity to say yes or no to it. The will is a capacity to affirm or deny, and for anything that comes before us, we have the capacity to stand back from ourselves. This is what the will is indeterminate is. This is what makes us rational animals, is that we don't just do stuff automatically, but for whatever we do, we've got the capacity to stand back from ourselves and to ask ourselves, do I want to do this? Is this justified? Yeah, so one way of thinking about the will is that it's the capacity to stand back and ask the question of justification. Yeah, is this justified? Should I do this? And so for any particular sort of desire, for anything particular, I can ask myself, should I do this? This is the will of indeterminacy. So let's have a look at what he says. So I'm going to work through this. He says, this is on page 37. He says, the will contains, first of all, A, the element of pure indeterminacy, or of the I's pure reflection into itself, in which every limitation, every content, whether present immediately through nature, through needs, desires, and drives, and given and determined in some way, is dissolved. This is the limitless infinity of absolute abstraction or universality, the pure thinking of oneself. So it's, in terms of action, it's the ability to question any action, but it's also the representation of the I think as this empty abstraction. And I take it that Hegel thinks that the Kantians take this as essential, this is basic. Yeah, this free will understood in this sense of pure indeterminacy as really the foundation. Yeah, you find this in Kant. You also find this in Fichte. Yeah, so you've got Kant, and then you've got Fichte's reading of Kant, a sort of radical Kantianism starts with the I think as this absolute capacity of positing that then posits its opposite. And so Fichte really does start with the I as this pure determinacy. So if you're interested, Fichte wrote the science of logic. There's if you're interested in German idealism, there's and you're interested in pre-Hegelian stuff, there's this guy called Friedrich Beiser who has a bunch of good books on this stuff, and he's got a book called The Fate of Reason. I think it's philosophy between Kant and Fichte. So if you want to know something about what was going on in German philosophy before Hegel, and he writes in a very journalistic way. He's very readable. He doesn't write like a German. Yeah, it's a sort of it's a pleasure to read. It's quite easy. He's also got a nice book on Hegel where he defends this sort of naturalistic reading of Hegel. So I think he's one of the more readable people who write about German idealism in English. So when I think about what I am, one thing that's really central to being a human being is our capacity for abstraction, of our capacity for reflection, of our capacity to stand back from ourselves. Yeah, so, and it's going to turn out that Hegel thinks this is important, but there's a danger of taking this to be fully what we are. Yeah, so a proper understanding of ourselves involves, in some sense, learning how to will our own finitude. Yeah, the true infinite is willing the finite. Yeah, I think in Nietzsche you get this idea of amor fati, yeah, that love of fate. But in some sense, what we need to do is to accept the finitude of our own being, and willing the finite is the true infinite. This is so he says, thinking of ourselves in this way as purely indeterminate. He says, only one aspect of these are his remarks, only one aspect of the will is defined here, namely this absolute possibility of abstracting from any determination in which I find myself or which I have posited in myself, the flight from every content as a limitation. So whatever content I'm given, whether it's a content of the will or a content of the intellect, I can always abstract, I can always reflect, I can always abstract from every determinate content. And he said this aspect of the will is tied to a certain notion of freedom. Yeah, it's the idea of the will as free in the negative sense. It's what is freedom? Ultimately, one way of thinking about what freedom is to be free involves having the capacity to say no. I'm free because anything that's given to me, I can reject. I've got the capacity to say no to anything that's given, either in terms of drives or in terms of perceptually given. Yeah, I can demand, and in some sense, this is going to be tied to this. We can always demand justification. It's going to be tied to this. So we have this notion of negative freedom that's tied to this conception of the I as indeterminate, and this is something he turns to in number 15, which is the idea of freedom. So if you look at number 5, read 5 together with number 15, where he talks about the idea of freedom understood as arbitrariness. So the German is Willkür, which is, I think in Turkish, keyfi, is that right? Yeah, like arbitrariness, keyfi. There's one conception of freedom, which is, to be free is just to have the capacity to freely choose randomly. Yeah, it pushes you to a limit. It's just this capacity of freedom of choice. And this freedom of choice, this Willkür, is going to turn out to be very important for freedom. But to understand freedom purely in these terms is to have a one-sided conception of the will, to have a one-sided conception of freedom. Now, Hegel's views on freedom are very much a reaction to Kant and to Fichte. If you're interested in freedom in Kant, there's a very nice book that it's by Henry Allison, and it's called, what's it called? Kant's Concept of Freedom, Henry Allison. Kant's yeah, if you have Allison, Kant and freedom. And he has a good discussion of how Kant conceptualizes freedom. And of course, for Kant, Willkür, freedom of the will, arbitrariness plays a central role. But Kant ultimately thinks that freedom involves the idea of autonomy and self-determination. And it turns out that this absolute conception of freedom is quite Kantian, in that it's got the idea of freedom as a form of self-determination. Yeah, but we might think that self-determination just involves the capacity to make arbitrary choices. And Hegel's going to suggest that this way of thinking about freedom is inadequate. So we're going to look at one inadequate view of freedom. We're going to look at another inadequate view of freedom, of the will, of the self, that is the kind of mirror image of it. And then both of these are going to be rejected because in some sense, both of them are sort of abstractions. Yeah, and that real freedom goes beyond them. Yeah, we have a dialectical move here, and then yeah. So let's have a look. So this, what time is it now? Okay. So hopefully I'll get through this section today, and then next class I'll talk about, and hopefully I'll be able to finish Hegel before we get to the absolute. So it'll be like, oops, yeah. I was just about to tell you what the absolute is, but I've got to go. You know, this is, yeah, but the absolute will, that's the trick in Hegel, and it's not exactly clear, but I think he's got something to say about the absolute that might be helpful. So this type of freedom, he says this is negative freedom, or the freedom of the understanding. So once again, this one-sidedness, he wants to tie one-sidedness to the understanding that thinks in terms of fixed categories. And then we have the absolute. We have freedom as it's understood by reason, which is able to think dialectically. So we have this whenever we got something about the understanding, we have this sort of one-sidedness in Hegel. This is the freedom of the void. Yeah, I like this, which raised to the status of an actual shape and passion. If it remains, so he thinks there's two expressions of this way of thinking of the self, a sort of a theoretical expression and a practical aspect. So the theoretical aspect is going to be what he calls the Hindu fanaticism. It's a sort of Buddhist emptying the mind. It's the sort of, I don't know, do you have people into mindfulness, kind of meditation? This is, yeah, so one way of thinking about this is the idea of becoming yourself is becoming nothing. Yeah, theoretically, you get your mind blank. So full, pure mindfulness is this state of something like nirvana. You have this Buddhist, what he calls the fanaticism of Hinduism. So he says, if it remains purely theoretical, it becomes in the religious realm the Hindu fanaticism of pure contemplation. So this idea of pure contemplation. I think you find this in Aristotle as well. You know, this idea of pure contemplation is the endpoint of philosophy, except Aristotle thinks that contemplation for us is something we can only do with friends. So for Aristotle, like Hegel, pure contemplation is social. Yeah, the thought, contemplation is thought thinking itself, and as human beings, the only way thought can think itself is with another. So it's in order to do philosophy, in order to engage in contemplation, for Aristotle, the best life for Aristotle is basically hanging out on the beach drinking wine and talking philosophy with your friends. Yeah. And that's basically the life of contemplation. And for us, contemplation requires others. We see it for Aristotle. I think for Hegel, contemplation requires something like mutual recognition. That self-consciousness is something that we don't do by turning inward. So the Buddhist, the mindfulness person, thinks that we acquire self-consciousness by turning inwards and getting rid of all content. This is a sort of nihilism. This is this idea of pure abstraction. Hegel thinks that we become self-conscious through mutual recognition. So for Hegel, self-consciousness is something we can only do with others. The drive towards self-consciousness is the drive for mutual recognition. A mutual recognition can only really occur within a society in which you have equality. So you only get the possibility of mutual recognition in a modern liberal state. Yeah. So self-consciousness you only get in a certain type of political society where you have a basic type of equality. The sort of Hindu, this is one of the first, I think, Western philosophers to talk extensively about Indian philosophy. Quite interesting. Leibniz talks a bit about Confucianism. I think that Hegel talks about Hinduism, that Schopenhauer was very influenced by Buddhism. It's beginning of learning about Western philosophy. So I think it's interesting. So he says, if it remains purely theoretical, it becomes in the religious realm, the Hindu fanaticism of pure contemplation. But if it turns to actuality, when we come to the practical aspect, this freedom of pure indeterminacy, it becomes, in the realm of both politics and religion, the fanaticism of destruction, demolishing the whole existing social order, eliminating all individuals regarded as suspect by a given order, and annihilating any organization which attempts to rise up anew. So theoretically, we have the kind of nihilism of what he takes to be the nihilism of Hindu philosophy, of Buddhism, of mindfulness, of self-consciousness that are purely turning inwards, and there's nothing there to find. So it's a sort of emptying of the mind. But when it's done practically, this becomes the idealistic, destructive revolutionary. It becomes the sort of revolutionary instinct that destroys all particularity. And the reason that Hegel thinks this is that he thinks that the political revolutionary basically has an abstract representation that they then use to compare to anything concrete. And the concrete always never fits the abstract. And so the only way, if you're driven by this desire to introduce perfection, is to destroy what's actual. So he says that only in destroying something does this negative will have a feeling of its own existence. It may well believe that it wills some positive condition, for instance, the condition of universal equality or of universal religious life, but it does not, in fact, will the positive actuality of this condition, for this at once gives rise to some kind of order. So whenever you build some actual institutions, any actual set of institutions is never going to live up to the representation of the ideal. Yeah, so he basically thinks that this idea of the will of pure indeterminacy, from the theoretical aspect, we have the sort of mindfulness, emptying the mind, coming to know oneself by emptying the mind, this sort of Buddhist or what he calls the Hindu fanaticism of pure contemplation. In the practical sphere, it involves having an idea that you can take a perspective outside of history, outside of the world, and have some sort of criteria by which to judge things that isn't embedded. You have some abstract ideal that you use to judge the real. And he thinks that taking this indeterminacy as basic is basically to will nothing. Yeah, so we have this sort of practical nihilism. And he says, it's precise. So this idea of freedom is negative. It's a sort of freedom to say no. It's the freedom to reject anything. You may feel that what it is to be free is your capacity to say no to what there is. And actually, that there's some truth to that. Hegel doesn't want to deny it, because it's our capacity to say no. It's our capacity to say no. Our capacity to ask why. Yeah, so we've got capacity to a capacity to, whenever you're given a justification, to ask for a new justification. Yeah, to seek ever new justifications and never be satisfied with any justification you're given. Yeah, this is what separates us from animals. So he's not saying that this isn't central to what it is to be free. It's a one-sided way of thinking about freedom. But he thinks it's a one-sided way of thinking about freedom that many people in his time have sort of bought into as what's really central to freedom. So he's got a bunch of stuff here where he's really talking about the French Revolution as an expression of negative freedom, of a capacity to reject institutions. And he thinks that, he says thus, whatever such freedom believes that it wills can in itself be no more than abstract representations, and its actualization can only be the fury of destruction. And then he says a bit more. So I think in the edition, he says a bit more about this aspect of freedom. He says, it's inherent in this element of the will, this will as pure indeterminacy, as universal, as infinite, that I'm able to free myself from everything, to renounce all ends, to abstract from everything. I'm able to renounce any possible end I had. The human being is alone able to abandon all things, even his own life. But the culmination of this type of freedom is the capacity to kill ourselves. Suicide is the ultimate act of, and he thinks that animals can't commit suicide. I'm not sure about that. We had a gerbil who committed suicide when I was a kid.
Especially birds when they put off their own what is that called?
Beak or beak?
No, not beak, like yeah.
Oh yeah.
So they can trust, so they can feed them, so they can die of starvation.
Yeah.
Or some people can drown, some animals can drown themselves.
Yeah, so I think like we had a gerbil that seemed to jump down, he had cancer, and then maybe was in pain and just lemmings jump over cliffs. I don't know, do they do it on purpose? But anyway, this capacity of freedom, we might think that one way in which we're free is that whatever we're faced with, we've always got the capacity to say no, which at its limit is the capacity to end our lives. Yeah, and he says the animal cannot do this. So I'm not sure this is right. I think animal subjectivity is maybe comes on a continuum. It always remains only negative in a determination which is alien to it and which it merely grows accustomed. The human being is pure thinking of himself, and only in thinking is he this power to give himself universality, that is to extinguish all particularity or determinacy. Now, what this is a capacity to kind of, in some sense, stand back from ourselves. Yeah, we've always got this capacity to divide. And I take it one way of thinking about this capacity is that self-conscious, I mean, this is the capacity of self-consciousness. Yes, so human beings are self-conscious. And self-conscious involves this capacity to kind of split ourselves. There's a sort of self-alienation. There's the I that's thinking and there's the I that's being thought. And there's always the possibility to identify ourselves with the I that's doing the thinking. Yeah. So whatever I've done, I can always stand back and say, no, that's not me, because I'm free. I can always choose to change my ways. I'm not a coward. This is a very, has anyone read Sartre? existentialism is a humanism. Do people know this? So it's a very nice, if anyone's interested, it's a very nice lecture he gave just after it's very readable. And but there's a certain sort of person who identifies themselves with their possibilities. You know, like, you know, I'm a great author. Oh, what have you written? I haven't written anything, but I plan to write something. I could write something. Yeah. That one way of thinking about yourself is to identify yourself with what you could be. And in some sense, you might think that the possibilities are limitless. Yeah. So part of this I is indeterminate is to identify yourself with what you could be, with pure potentiality. Now, who am I? Well, I could be anyone. You know, I could have been a contender. You know, I at any moment, I could suddenly change what I do. And that's who I really am. All this shit I've done, that's not really who I am, because I've got this capacity to do other stuff. I've got this potential. What I am is pure possibility. That's the sort of idea. And then there's a sort of tendency, one sort of tendency we have is to identify ourselves with our potentiality, with our pure possibility. Now, he thinks that this view is sort of one-sided. So on the top of page 39, he said, this freedom or the freedom of the understanding is one-sided. And this one-sidedness always contains within itself an essential determination and should therefore not be dismissed. Yeah, the defect of the understanding is that it treats a one-sided determination as unique and elevates it to the supreme status. So one thing is that our freedom as negative is always situated. Yeah, it's the possibility space. In some sense, I haven't chosen. Yeah, so you come into this world. This is something that Sartre and de Beauvoir talk about. And I think it's very much coming out of Hegel. That oh, I wondered where these were. These are these are from last week. Maybe I shouldn't eat them, yeah? They've been sitting here since last Wednesday, and I've been looking for this box. I was like, I knew, and it wasn't in my bag. Brilliant. Okay. What was I about? Yeah, so, I mean, you're born into this world, and the possibility space is sort of given. So you might come into this world and you live in a world in which there are norms that govern, say, what it is to be a woman. Yeah? So to be a woman, you're supposed to behave in a certain way and of course, you've got the choice whether to endorse those norms or not. But the basic norms are already out there. Yeah, they're in some sense, your choice is always a choice in a world of norms that are already there. A sort of a factual, a world of something given. And what's given isn't just the tables and chairs, but you've got the sort of norms that govern your society. And that these norms, yeah, so this freedom isn't absolute. This freedom is always a kind of contextual freedom. Yeah, it's a freedom to say yes or no to a certain given content, but the content in some sense is given. Yeah, and I take it that the Hegel's idea is that the content itself, though, insofar as it's a content of norms, these are sort of norms that are themselves the expression of rational activity. Yeah, and so in a well-functioning society, one can reflexively endorse the norms that maybe first of all appear as arbitrary, that appear as given, but to see them as the result of activity. But then, of course, what about if you live in a society where there's a huge amount of sexism? Yeah. Okay, so this is, how long have we got now? I'm wondering whether we have time to, I can't see the time and there's no clock. Okay, yeah, so, so at the bottom here, he once again talks about the Hinduism and he talks about the French Revolution. I think he has a nice thing about the French Revolution. I'll finish with that. And then next class, we're going to do a bit more on Mill, on Hegel, we'll do 6 and 7, and then we're like a class behind, and then we'll move on to Mill. The reason about Mill is here, we have the absolute is the idea of freedom as individuality. And then chapter 3 of On Liberty and Mill is also a defense of individuality. And Mill is, I think, sort of influenced by Humboldt, by German Romanticism. So I think there is a sort of, both of them in some sense, are defenders of a kind of conception of individuality. So an example of this, of active fanaticism, was the reign of terror in the French Revolution, during which all differences of talents, this is on page 39, and authority was supposed to be cancelled out. This was a time of trembling and quaking and of intolerance towards everything particular. So you could, anything particular, anything actual is the enemy of the ideal. For fanaticism wills only what is abstract, not what is articulated, so that whenever difference emerges, differences emerge, it finds them incompatible with its own indeterminacy and cancels them. This is why the people during the French Revolution destroyed once more the institutions that they themselves had created, because all institutions are incompatible with the abstract self-consciousness of equality. So Hegel thinks that here you have some abstract idea of equality, yeah, but this is going to be incompatible with all sorts of, Hegel thinks, with all sorts of institutions, actual institutions. And so I take it that in this kind of positive thing, that you recognize the ideal within the concrete, ideally. Now, of course, this is something you can only do if you're living in a well-functioning society. So if you're in a messed up society, then all you can really do is say no. But insofar as you've got some basic well-functioning within your society, and Hegel thought you found this within you can find this within the modern state, within the modern semi-liberal state, then I think he thinks that real freedom involves, in some sense, willing determinacy, but only insofar as you find the universal within the particular. Yeah, and so real willing involves willing the universal in the particular. This is the sort of idea, and you can only do this, and therefore it involves being reconciled. It involves living in a community where you can reflexively endorse it, and this is why true willing involves this sort of reconciliation to reality. So you need this philosophical reconciliation. This is going to be a central part of what it is to really will. That you come to see yourself in the particular. Yeah. Yeah.
So we can't talk about the will if there's no more state like this. We're talking about the nature. Those people don't have wills.
So yeah, so Hobbes, so the slave, in some sense, the slave doesn't have a will. The slave can't really act. Yeah, and this is why slavery is so bad, because in some sense the slave isn't capable of self-determination. Yeah, and so slavery, if you're a slave, you can't really act. But Hegel thinks in the phenomenology of this master-slave dialectic, he thinks that the slave owner, the master, is also hobbled by this relationship. Yeah. So true action, I think one sort of thought is that true action involves a certain type of self-consciousness. Yeah, that involves this reflexive endorsement that has both a theoretical and a practical side. These are two aspects of the same thing. So true freedom is in a certain sense self-consciousness. It's thought thinking itself, it's willing itself, it's sort of self-determination. And this self-determination we can think of from the theoretical side as something like self-consciousness. But self-consciousness for Hegel is going to be mutual recognition. So he's got this idea that becoming conscious of oneself is something you can only do with others. And self-consciousness requires the possibility of mutual recognition and mutual respect. And so self-consciousness is only possible within a certain type of community. And so he thinks that a slave isn't able to be free, that they're not able to recognize themselves, because everything they do is alien to themselves. Yeah, and so that, and then, I think the Marxist idea that the worker isn't able to recognize themselves in their labor. Yeah, you might think that there's a certain type of alienation that undermines the possibility of self-consciousness stroke self-determination. Yeah, and that in a very unequal society, I think the state of nature for Hobbes, Hegel's criticism of Hobbes is going to be that the state of nature itself is an abstraction. There's no such thing as the state of nature. There's no such thing as a Hobbesian state of nature, because human beings are essentially social animals. I don't know if you've taken a class with Ken, you've probably heard him say stuff like this. Yeah, and I think this is right, and I think this is a sort of a very Hegelian sort of idea that like in the state of nature, we have this idea of individuals as sort of free, as unembedded. We have this atomistic conception of human beings. And so in some sense, the Hobbesian state of nature starts off with an abstract conception of the human individual. Yeah, as in some sense, having a nature-free society. But I take it that the Hegel's idea is that human beings always have a second nature, because we're inherently social animals. And so we can't understand, I mean, our nature is always the result of our socialization and our sociability. Yeah.
We don't necessarily have to have a modern state, right? The social structure should be sufficient for absolute will.
Yeah, so I mean, Hegel's got a story. You can leave if you want. I mean, I don't mind carrying on for a bit, but we've gone over the time. So Hegel's got this story about history, and he basically thinks that in the ancient world, in some sense, in the ancient world, you have something more like this. So the ancient world didn't really value freedom, and that in the ancient world, the people's identity was purely objectional. So in number 15, he talks about, hold on. Oh no, he talks about, yeah, in number 26, he talks about the totally objective will. And the totally objective will is a will that doesn't really have this subjectivity, doesn't really have freedom, that in some sense identifies fully with the particularity and doesn't have this moment of freedom, of justification. And he says that the totally objective will, insofar as it lacks the infinite form of, this is on page 55 to 56, of self-consciousness, is the will immersed in its object or conditions, whatever the content of the latter may be. It is the will of the child, or the will of the slave, or the will of the superstitious. So he has this story about the Greek world, where in some sense, and I think this is false, but he had this idea that the Greeks identified fully with the community. And so they didn't have this kind of private subjectivity, that they didn't value individual freedom, but really they fully identified themselves as members of the polis, as members of the community. So in the Greek world, you have this kind of communitarianism without reflection. Yeah, so you have something like you fully identify with your contingent particularity, but with no real reflection. And so I think he thinks that in very traditional pre-modern societies, you have a tendency for people to unreflexively identify with the community, but it's not a sort of rational self-identification. Yeah, so in modernity, so in some sense, the I is universal, infinite. This is kind of an aspect of self-understanding that is very modern. So this aspect of identity sort of, strongly emerged with the Protestantism. And this is something that there's a certain brand of Protestantism, romanticism, that just identifies itself purely with this. Yeah. Hegel wants to kind of keep both. Yeah. But I think he thinks in the ancient world that, if you'd have to look at his lectures on world history, yeah, and so he tells this story of the ancient world, of kind of, it's a bit racist, you've got Oriental despotism, the East, the Turk, who is, so I think he thinks that in modernity, that we have the rise of a self-understanding that involves all of this. But then in some sense, there's a tendency to identify fully with this, which just leads to this alienation, which leads to a certain type of nihilism. And one reason I'm stressing the nihilism is we're going to be reading Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's also interested in nihilism and modernity. And Okay, so next class we'll finish off Hegel. With Hegel, I'm really giving you a sort of taster. So we're just looking a little bit. And then I think Mill is this is the hardest stuff to understand. Yeah, it's the most obscure and weird stuff. Mill is a lot easier. Nietzsche is much easier to read. And then Wittgenstein's sort of hard, but a bit clearer. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Oops.